And when I get through with the PowerPoint, then I'll do a couple of quick demos. I'll actually show you how I did the inlay and how I made the beads on the door. I have all the materials here on the table, and we'll talk about some of the jigs. And one thing about jigs that someone was talking about them earlier, if you can't make a jig accurate, make it adjustable. And it's probably easier to make it adjustable than it is to make it accurate. This is a Seymour tambour desk. And it was made by John and Thomas Seymour. That was a father and son. John Seymour was from Axminster, England. And he worked as a carpenter and a joiner during the period of like 1760 to 1780. And during that period, he worked doing construction jobs and building houses, and he did exteriors and interiors and everything else. But he had a chance to see some work of a famous architect by the name of Robert Adam. And he was exposed to this neoclassicism that was going on at the period. So all this fancy stuff that they were putting on the ceilings and the walls and so on. If you're not familiar with Robert Adams' work, you need to look up his name and see the type of stuff that he did. He was an architect and a decorator. I don't know whether he did much building, but he did a lot of the design work. And that's a lot of his stuff actually came out of Herculaneum when they uncovered all the pumice off of all the pieces from the volcano, and it was really interesting. The English economy declined right after the American Revolution. The English spent all their money fighting us, and they lost, so they were broke. And John was 50 years old. This was in 1784. And he decided to immigrate to America, and he was married, and he had 8 kids. The oldest was John Jr., and he was 19. Thomas, which is the one that worked with him to build this piece, he was 13. And the youngest was 5 years old, and I think he had 5 boys and 3 girls. So they ended up in Portland, Maine. And this was in 1784, and he got established there, and he worked there until 1792, and ended up having to build the whole town because the town had been wiped out by the British. So he was doing a lot of this joinery and carpenter work, and occasionally someone would ask him to make a piece of furniture. And in that period, he started out with just basic furniture made out of pine, but he started bringing some of his English background in, and he had picked up a lot of pointers on making furniture. At that point, he wasn't a cabinet maker, but he became one. They moved. John Jr., the oldest, died in 1792, and he was 27 years old at the time. And they had been working in their own little shop, and they had built up a fairly good business. Besides building all the houses in town, they were also making furniture. So it was he and his 4 sons. John passed away. They moved to Boston, and they were in Boston starting 1792. The family kind of splintered. Some people, the girls I think, stayed in Maine. The boys went with him down to Boston, and they set up another shop down there, and they started making furniture. And they were more in the cabinet making business now once they got into Boston, and they were competing with furniture coming from England, and furniture being made by a whole bunch of other cabinet makers in Boston and their own. And this is a typical piece that they were making around 1792 and shortly after, up to about 1796. The setup of the business was quite successful when they first started, and went on for maybe 8 years or so. And then the tax records show that about 8 years after they got there, they were living in a one-room house. They owned their own tools and they owned furniture. And the most money that they had on the books at the time was $450. They had just transferred from the pound to the dollar at this particular time. And they were renting a shop, which they called the manufactory. And they owned no property. They had owned property in Maine when they were up there, and they sold all of that to take the money to go down and set up the business in Boston. And they never were able to buy any property in Boston to speak of. They had a hard time selling their furniture. The furniture just was too complicated to make any money on. They put too much time in. They had apprentices, they had journeymen working for them. They had to pay all these guys. They ended up with just John and Thomas, because the other two boys were engravers, and they went to Pennsylvania. They went down to Philadelphia to work as engravers. So it was John and Thomas that were working together. And John was getting old. He'd been doing this for a long time. So about 1804, they had to move to a new location because the person they were renting from didn't want them there anymore. They couldn't pay their bills on time. So John was 66 at this time, and Thomas was 33. And about 1813 is when John passed away. And for about 23 years, Thomas worked in the Boston area, but the records are very scarce about what he did. It seems like he ended up working as a journeyman for a lot of other cabinet makers. He didn't have his own shop. And basically, he ended up, he died in 1848 at the age of 77, and he ended up in a pauper's grave. So, I'm in the same boat. I make this stuff, I can't sell it. But I like emulating what they did. It's just phenomenal stuff. And I have a little article here that I'd like to read that was in Maine Antiques Digest, which is a newspaper that I sign up for. There's almost an instinctive urge to list any tambour secretary as a Seymour piece. They are that famous for them. This example was made early on in their Boston years, probably between 1793 and 1796. So that's pretty early on and when they got to the States. And it's labeled John Seymour Sons and Sons, Cabinet Makers, Creek Square, Boston. And it's also initialed and signed in chalk. The tambour secretaries produced later often had bookcase tops, so instead of just having this little top on it, they had a huge bookcase top with fancy doors and a lot of gold leaf on them. I've gone through 30 years of Boston newspapers and found it amazing how much new furniture was sold for at auction. Robert Mussey was the one that said that, and his book is the one that I work out of for making these pieces and also visiting museums. This particular secretary that he's talking about, I have it open to the page there. This secretary is one of those pieces believed sold at auction, an interesting start for the life of a piece that is now in the possessions of the Winterthur Gallery, Winterthur Museum in Delaware. So these pictures on this side of the table, if you have a chance to look at them later, are of a piece that I was able to see at Winterthur. I chose to reproduce this piece because I've seen a lot of them, and I kind of fell in love with the style and the piece itself. I visited the State Department in Boston, in D.C. I went to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, found another one there. They have one at the DeWitt Wallace Gallery in Williamsburg, where I go quite often, every year at least. And I had this textbook that was it was put together by Robert Mussey, and it was on a show that they had at the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts, and it's just a phenomenal book. It's all about the Seymours. It's entitled The Masterworks of John and Thomas Seymour, and it's by Robert Mussey. During one of our seminars in Williamsburg, we had a fellow by the name of Robert Millard give us a lecture on how to work this piece, how to build this piece. And he spent a lot of time on the tambours. I liked what he was doing, but I questioned some of the approaches he was taking. It seemed like he spent a lot of time. When he made the tambour, he cut little pieces of wood, and I'm going to show you how I did that. But then he took a piece of veneer and he inlaid the decoration in the veneer. Then he put all those little pieces of wood together and glued the veneer on the front, and had to go back and cut in between those pieces so the decoration would end up on the front of the pieces of wood. I'm going to use a different approach. And I think the approach I used on this is pretty close to the way they did it at the time, because I know at that time they were trying to make some money. In order to make money, time is very important. So I actually bought the plans to build this. They were measured plans from one of the pieces that I just talked about by Robert Millard. He sold me the plans. He sells them for some of the pieces that he builds. And I followed him pretty much. I'm going to talk about this for just a minute, and then we'll move on. But this is all made out of Cuban mahogany. It's Spanish mahogany or Sweetina mahogany. And beautiful wood, beautiful to work with, and it is a pleasure to work with hand tools. And it's very tight grained, it's heavy, very dense, but it cuts like butter with nice sharp tools. The secondary wood in this is eastern white pine, and that was exactly the same as the original. I actually sent off to England and got this baize, which is a woven felt. The felt that you find today in the United States is just compressed. This is actually woven, and it's the same thing that they had in the original desk. And I think I got pretty close to the same color. I was able to see one at Winterthur, that's the one I have the pictures of here, and I got the curator to open the door that hadn't been opened for a long time. And the paint, although it wasn't quite this color, if you look in the photograph, you can see I was able to get pretty close to it. And that's 200 years old, so it's got to change color a little bit. But it had been protected by the door being closed. The hardware is from Horton Brasses and another company, Ball and Ball. And these little things here are ridiculously expensive. And they had to be just that size or I couldn't close the door. I'm going to talk about, I'm going to call this the door closing molding, or the door molding in the PowerPoint, so you know what I'm talking about when I start talking about the lock. And I'll be explaining this mechanism, locking mechanism. You notice the key is off center. and you'll see why that's that way. The inlay here on the top, I'd like to show the inlay up close. It's an inlay that I made, and this is pretty straightforward, pretty simple. And I can come to you if necessary. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay. So what I did here, this isn't actually the one that I used. This is what I used to demonstrate. This is maple and ebony. Okay. And the one that's on the piece is actually ebony and holly. But this is how we make it. We glue up these pieces and then slice off a whole bunch of these. And then they're sandwiched together, get them going in the right direction so you can see what I'm doing here. They're sandwiched together in between some veneer. So I have a whole row of these all together. And then they're laying on top of a black veneer and a green veneer in this particular case. And I have a little piece of white veneer. So there's black, green, and white, and then this row, and then white, green, and black. It's all sandwiched together. It's glued in a press, and then I take it out, and I can slice off these at whatever thickness I want using a 16th inch circular saw on my table saw. So I want to have, if I go through all the trouble to make this, I don't want to waste it with an 1/8 inch blade. So the best blade I could find is a Tenaru. It's a Japanese blade and a 16th inch carbide. Works really well. And you have to use a really good insert, saw insert for that, so that it doesn't pull all the pieces down underneath and vacuum them out. We'll go back to just me talking here for a minute about the desk. The inlay on the door is holly, and the same on the legs. And this is a unique inlay that the Seymours did, and I'll show you how I found that and how I got the right size. This is exactly the same size as was on the desk that I have photographs of, and I'll show you how I transferred that. One other thing, the swags. The swags were something that Robert Adam put in a lot of his decorations in the houses. There were swags on the ceilings and on the walls, around picture frames. They were on the furniture and so on. The Seymours did something it's there, and if you don't know where to look for it, you don't see it. This is a swag, but this is also a swag in the veneer of the door, of the drawer. So that's a piece of crotch mahogany that's been turned upside down and sliced at the right place that gives you this effect that it's a swag, and it kind of ties the two pieces together. I also use that string inlay to tie the two pieces together.